This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Ousmane Power-Greene, who teaches in the Department of History at Clark University. Along with numerous scholarly and public-facing pieces, he is the author of Against Wind and Tide, The African-American Struggle Against the Colonization Movement from 2014, the novel The Confessions of Matthew Strong from 2022, and is currently completing a book-length study of Hubert Harrison, Black Radical Thought, and African-American emigration movements. In this conversation, we discuss intellectual work and its impact on Black politics, the relationship between art and political life, and how creative work and historical writing intertwine in a Black studies context. Ousmane, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
I'm super excited to have you on the podcast for a lot of reasons. I mean, we've known each other a while and share some Valley time there in Pioneer Valley. And so that's always nice for me to sort of reconnect with my older life. Also, I mean, your research, both published and I know you're forthcoming, super interesting stuff. I think absolutely essential to the field of Black studies. And you have your PhD in the field. And, Ashley and I have been really, we think it's really important to have people with PhDs in the field on this series, because I think that perspective is just really very different, right? Has a kind of richness of insight. And so for all those reasons, really excited to have you on the podcast. Looking forward to this conversation, and welcome.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Love the opportunity to be documented through some sort of way, perspectives that get into or go beyond just the sort of writerly or academic elements of it, talk about the field. We got to do that too. So
I feel like just why not? We should give Chris and Joy a shout out. That's where we used to see
yes.
So, hey, Chris.
We got to send them a copy. Definitely send them a copy. I've had many conversations with Chris particularly, but also Joy about Black culture, literature, et cetera. So
I'm just thinking about how many holiday parties we got to eat Joy's treats. So anyway,
awesome.
So we'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you think about the field of Black studies and the relationship between these things. But I wanted to start off really with the more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in this kind of work?
Yeah, well, I think that, one must go to the roots. I was blessed to be raised by two people, Gwendolyn Greene and my dad, Bill Greene. My dad since passed on 2017, who raised me to want to understand Black history, Black culture, dragging me to Alvin Ailey, kicking and screaming. I grew up in New York, everybody. So born in Harlem. My mom, is from North Carolina. So when things got hectic in the 70s, she was like, yeah, we got to get out of here. Because my dad was raised in Harlem. And so we moved to Westchester, so predominantly white community. But they went out of their way to keep me grounded in my culture, right? So regardless of growing up in the suburbs, they drug me in. Both my grandparents still lived in Harlem. And so, I'd spend weeks in Harlem in the same neighborhood that I was born in and sort of raised in. And, over across street from Dunbar Apartments, anybody, all my New Yorkers out there, Esplanade Gardens across the street, Harlemites. And so, when I got, into came of age, as a young person, sports was the passion, like many of us. When I came of age in college and sort of finding myself gravitating intellectually and being curious about things beyond sort of sports and relationships, I found my calling and my courses on history. Shout out Adrian Israel, who's retired, but I went to Guilford College my freshman year, so very small Quaker school in North Carolina. And she was my African history professor there, and she inspired me. In my U.S. history class, I remember taking, doing the Black Panthers, my first freshman year research paper. And so
Hmm.
I feel like as I came to intellectual maturity, I began to see the value in the work that my parents were doing to help me understand and appreciate, Black history, culture, and life. And so soon I transferred to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Um, and I found myself under the tutelage of the greats, such as the late Colin Palmer, those in Black studies. One would hope Colin Palmer's work. Um, you know, and just, yeah, Kenneth Jenkins, shout out Kenneth Jenkins. And I just found that to be my home, Black studies and history. And so, I did we had to do like, our capstone paper essentially. And I did mine on Bob Moses, and which my dad is the one that said, "You gotta do Bob Moses. Ain't not enough on Bob Moses. He was the most important figure in the movement." Because my dad was in the movement. He was the most important figure. No one gives him any credit. And so,
I love that.
yeah, so I did Bob Moses. Yeah, so that was the trajectory. And then when it came to grad school, I taught. My ambitions were really to work in urban areas. I had worked at the Fresh Air Fund with kids from the city, when I was in college and afterwards. And I thought I would find myself, as a teacher, potentially, obviously urban teacher, working maybe principal in a school. And then, I sort of came to the conclusion that I really wanted to be a writer. I had always loved writing. I always wanted to be a writer. And I decided that rather than, I was teaching in a boarding school up here in Mass, actually, while I was getting my degree in, my sort of certification and my master's in education. And I decided that my passion really was for writing, to be a writer. And, I'd been writing a ton of fiction. I was taking courses in this education program with people like John Higginson, was a huge mentor of mine. And I was like, you know what, actually, I need to pursue this. And so that's what got me applying to graduate schools for history and also Black studies. And after a year of applying to some history programs, the next year I decided I was just going to apply to Black studies. Just UMass Amherst, and I would just stay here and keep applying until they let me in.
I like that. I like that.
And I think it was like, I think it was like they had 100 applicants. They took like 5, so I knew my odds were low. I was not a great student as an undergrad. Had a very bad first semester at Carolina. It was a fun semester, everybody, but was not a good academic semester. So I was sort of crawling out of that the rest of my career. So yeah, I knew the odds were not with me in terms of getting into UMass Amherst. But yeah, I decided Black Studies was it. That's where I wanted to go. That's what I wanted to do. And so I only applied there. Was blessed to get in, and did work with Manisha, John Bracey, Ernie Allen, and all them over there. And yeah, I am a product of the UMass Amherst Black Studies program. And of course, obviously the affiliates, history, and those at Amherst College and other places. Shout out Kevin Quashie, Smith College, now at Brown.
Yeah, this, I should have said that. I'm glad it came up. I mean, just the historical significance of the UMass program. I mean, I kind of note that when we have had UMass grads as well as Temple grads. I mean, these are such important programs historically. I mean, there are no more important programs outside of maybe San Francisco State that way, but for these PhDs. And I really like that. I'm just going to keep applying until they accept me, and I'm glad that they did. And I also just love your father like leaning on you to do a project that ended up like connecting you to all these things. It's a beautiful thing to have left you with. I'm interested then.
I will tell you a good story about that, though. Let me tell you a good story real quick,
please.
John. Let me jump in and just tell you something that I think our listeners. So my dad was from the movement, right? And so when I told him I was going to go try to apply to a PhD program, he's like, "Why? Why would you get a PhD if you want to be an intellectual?" Right? So that tells you a lot about his politics and his belief about, professional intellectuals, academic scholars who, even my colleagues at UMass, my mentors, they had very similar views about the academy. And so my dad, he really was not supportive of me doing the PhD. He said, "You want to be a writer? Be a writer. Get out to be a journalist." My dad was a journalist. That was his ambitions, So anyway, I just want to point out to people that, while I did grow up with that background, I certainly was not necessarily encouraged to do a PhD because there was a view, which I don't know if it's still there, of that generation that the academy is not the place for serious intellectual work towards uplifting the Black community. You know what I mean? And that might be a historical phenomenon also, although we might be coming in an age where we still feel like that. But that was that generation. You know, most of my professors did not have PhDs. So anyway, I just thought that'd be important for our listeners to sort of have a context.
Yeah, no, I think that's this really important way of phrasing a question that is so central to Black studies broadly, which is, what is an intellectual? And
Mm,
I think that what an intellectual is, like, what is intellectual content for teaching? What is intellectual content for writing? But also, what does it mean to be a Black studies intellectual in 2026?
mhm,
That level of, not that level, but that phrasing of a question to me is so important because, as you pointed out, I mean, the people who are writing in the service of the liberation of Black people, this is not the professoriate historically. And so there's intellectual life has been elsewhere, by the thousands. And so I love that. And it helps shape a little bit of that, like, why Black studies instead of history, in the sense of
mhm,
connecting with a university place where there was a connection to at least that idea of an intellectual. Yeah. And I'm sure as we
mhm,
get into talking more about Black studies, you have a lot to say about that. But I'm interested in terms of, you had these, three parts of your undergraduate work, your graduate work, and the way your family was really insistent on a sort of connection to Black culture, Black life, Black history, and politics. Was all of this sort of working in tension, sort of K through 12 with your sense of
mhm.
schooling? Or was it kind of like that was also this place where you were discovering these same kinds of trajectories, values, and orientations? And I ask that because
Mhm.
so often that K through 12 ends up having a really intense tension, right, with the sort
Yeah.
of community family stuff, and then college ends up being this shift of perspective around education and Black struggle. But sometimes they
Yeah.
they have a little bit more intimacy. So I'm interested to hear about that.
It's interesting, again, growing up in basically I was a micro minority, I call it. I wasn't even a minority in my school. I was like one of five or something in my class. I was like, we were very few Black people.
Okay.
I was blessed because, in my town, I had these teachers, Miss Hirsch, shout out Miss Hirsch, fourth grade teacher who, went out of her way to give me materials on like Black history and like would pull me aside and be like, yo, I got this. And photos and images that she had gotten for, I think her daughter worked on Broadway or something. And she had all these images. So, then later, Mr. Pozick, my ninth grade teacher, I was still a knucklehead running around, wasn't conscious, but he did stuff on South Africa and apartheid. And that really, as a social studies teacher, had a big impact on me and very interested in that as a history teacher. And so even though I was not a conscious person, I was listening to hip hop, breakdancing, and playing basketball and football and lacrosse. And, I still was being surrounded by people who were showing me a path of intellectual life and thinking. And it clearly it
Mm.
mattered to me, even if I didn't sort of get good grades and didn't aspire to get good grades. I was curious. And I always wrote poetry and creative writing, and I love films. And so, because of all of that, as I began to see the possibility of that, so in other words, that K through 12 education, even if it didn't have like I wasn't a direct path, and my teachers, would be surprised that I'd go on to become a professor because I just did not express outwardly a sort of intellectualism.
Mhm.
Maybe they saw it, and people say, "Oh yeah, no, you're always smart," but I certainly did not have, didn't I just didn't care about school very much. I just wanted to be in the NBA.
Look, I mean, this is one of these like lessons for educators, and we all know it, but it's so easy to forget. Like, you just never know what this like seed scattering does with the student, like
Yep.
when that shit dog wakes up like 10, 15 years later, or 2 years later, 1 year later. So I love that. And I'm glad I asked because those I love those teachers making sure that they didn't participate in this you know uh micro minority is a bleak phrase, man. For real. But reproducing that in terms of curriculum and knowledge. So um Well, let me ask you, your PhD's in the field, so always a
Mhm,
little extra curious to hear responses to this question. I'm interested to hear what the portrait of Black studies is for you. Like, what is that portrait for you? What idea of Black studies, vision of Black studies do you work with? And I ask this in the context of its founding, which had its intellectual
mhm,
dimension. And that's something we inherit today in terms of a commitment to an intellectual tradition, which was the demand by students in the late 1960s, early 1970s that there be a place on campus for Black life to be studied. And the disciplines hadn't done that. Black studies was going to be and has been that. And so again, like we inherit that in
mhm,
terms of a certain commitment to the tradition in the field. But of course, the founding of Black Studies is also that moment where the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really contested those boundaries between a campus and a community, between a classroom and mobilization, between books and prescriptive action. And so sort of thinking of it in that context, we inherit also a sense of political orientation in Black studies that has a tension with that intellectual
mhm.
life. And not a contradiction, but a tension. And I'm interested in that context, how you imagine the field, what portrait you work with, and how it orients you.
Yeah, yeah, I think a lot about this. So for me, the portrait is a portrait of, W.B. Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper, right? So you got two people that are gonna live for long and have impacts long, till present. But both people believed that the intellectual work you do should be in service to Black people specifically in places like DC, adult ed work that Cooper did. And then, of course, with Du Bois, constantly breaking the boundaries, between, professional intellectual life and activist intellectualism. And so, both figures represent, two expressions of Black studies. Now, of course, they couldn't get PhDs in Black studies, right? They are the progenitors of something that they maybe imagined, maybe couldn't even imagine. Um, but we stand in the shadow of the type of commitment. That's the key, everybody. The commitment to doing intellectual work, thinking and writing and presenting about the, various social, economic, and political circumstance we find ourselves in during our era. And then with the information we discover, trying to find pathways to have an impact on our, on every level, local, right, national, international, right, now, past, present, future, right. So our ambitions in Black studies as a field is extraordinarily ambitious, and it carries with it a spirit of commitment, and a spirit of, liberation theology, we can call it what it is, whatever it is, but the spirit that the work we're doing is rooted in a desire to analyze for the purpose of destroying institutional practices that perpetuate inequality
Mm.
against Black people, but against everyone. Because many of us in Black studies lean left, right? So we're not just talking about oppressed people, Black Americans. We're talking about oppressed people everywhere in human history, right? So our ambitions are broad, and all of us, should be in service to those ambitions. So that's my view. I know it's a hefty burden, and we carry it hopefully with honor, but also with humility. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Because the greats, and I mean that's for my mentors as well, and some of our contemporary greats right now doing great work. Are our inspiration.
And I think that sense of humility is so important because it's often the difference between imagining yourself like the sort of authoritarian leader and sort of sole information source of a certain kind of struggle versus I mean I think is where humility brings us to a participation in a broader struggle where you're making a particular kind of contribution that is essential, but not, the vanguard, the sort of single figure as vanguard. And I think humility does so much of that work. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And let me ask you then about your work, in
Mhm.
particular in relation to the field of Black studies historically, right, and in the present. You're interested in sort of critical approaches to African American history, transnational studies, political theory, and there's so many interesting insights that come from this collection of frames. And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you understand or think about your work in relation to the history of the field of Black studies. Like, where does it fit? How is it a part of the
Mhm.
tradition? But also, what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what horizons do you think it opens up?
Um, so I think in a couple ways. I mean, I do, my projects, I'm just trying to think about trying to be specific and not abstract. So the book project I'm working on right now, an uneasy alliance, African Americans, the American Colonization Society in Liberia, is at once, a study of the sort of Pan-African vision of finding a place where Black Americans could collaborate with, indigenous folk and people in the diaspora, people from Barbados and up there, as a way to sort of build a homeland, a sort of vision, which goes back, at least to the founding of the nation. And so I've been interested in terms of this book project, thinking critically about the previous generations of scholars, including Du Bois, Benjamin Brawley, shout out Brawley, who have, and have continued to try to reconcile the contradictions that emerged when you have this different group of people intersecting, and trying to build a country together. And it's the type of challenge and problem that I think, that Black studies scholars who are interested in more historical work continue to go back to look at the foundations of what we could think about as a sort of Pan-Africanism or a global Black sense, a notion of Blackness that is encompassed in diverse ways, in diverse places, but all share obviously the legacies of enslavement and European colonialism, but also attempt to restore a sense of pride in the accomplishments of people on the continent, in the
Mhm.
diaspora. And so my work is very much attempting to do that. Um, it is one dimension, of what I've been interested in. I mean, when I finish this book project, I'll turn my attention back to Hubert Harrison, and looking at Harrison's role as a critic and the role of the critic in Black intellectual life, because so many of our, Black studies scholars also were critics, playwrights, and they were producing critiques of white American texts, but also Black texts, and also being cultural workers. And that's a dimension of Harrison's life that really has not, been explored in much
Mm.
detail because he obviously was such an influential Black radical, right? And he did so many important things. So I'm interested in the intersection of the arts too, right? And, obviously one of my mentors is not obviously. Those who are listening, one of my mentors is James Smethurst, who's done some, pioneering work on Black studies and Black arts movement. Um, and so, courses I took with him, my one of my earliest intellectual mentors, Ernie Allen. I went to UMass to study with Ernie Allen and to write about Harrison. And so in many ways, this journey has been about a 25-year journey of my interest in
Mm.
trying to think about Harrison's role within the broader context of Black studies. Been some great works by scholars on Harrison, and we got to continue to do it because he was a complicated figure in the sense, and more, it was complicated, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is that he had, like, in the tradition of Black studies, broad interests, but all in service to thinking about ways to uplift Black people.
I love that. Thank you for that. And it sort of moves, especially this last bit about your interest in the arts and radical politics and history and transnational concerns. I'm interested to hear then a little bit about how your graduate training and your current appointment and so forth so come together to shape how you do research, because your PhD's in Black studies, you teach in a history department. You
Mhm.
obviously have deep historian sensibilities as a writer and researcher, but you're also interested in arts, right? You're also interested in
Yeah.
these other cultural and political questions. So, of course, that movement for you from Black studies to history is a movement from a non-discipline, or at least not a traditional discipline of Black studies,
Mhm.
to a traditional discipline in history.
Yeah.
but I'm interested how that collection of places or pairing of places shapes how you understand and conceive and execute a research project, but also how you
Mhm.
construct and practice a classroom.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of research, what has been so important and instrumental for me in terms of Black studies is studying under scholars, using different approaches to answering questions, right? And so in the case of Professor Smethurst and his work in Black arts movement, he's asking a series of questions relevant to cultural history, and relevant to the role of art and intellectual life and creativity. And so by studying Black studies, what you get in a very natural way the intersections, right? By being able to look at similar questions, the same people from different vantage points, because many of our figures, um, were expressed themselves through the arts as well as through whatever intellectual work they were doing. I'm writing about Liberia. One gets to think about Hilary Teague, who was an important person in Liberia, editor of the journal. You read Liberian Herald, and he's writing poetry and he's writing book reviews. People are multidisciplinary who do this work towards, um, trying to raise up Black people. And so, how does one, what's the best way to approach those types of that type of intellectual work? For me, Black studies, because you have the ability to be trained, right, in political thought. Shout out Bill Strickland, who recently passed away, right? So you got, political thought. You have, Smethurst cultural history, right? Archie Shepp was in the department. I was able to take, an art class, music classes, and these, Nelson Stevens in terms of the art class, everybody, these shape my thinking, my creativity. And I have never, and those that know me know that my creative input as a fiction writer, is an illustration of the ways in which I think how important it is to communicate, convey information, and delve into the imagination as in broad ways as possible. And so for me, Black Studies is the only PhD I wanted to do because it had the essential elements that I found crucial to my own intellectual and creative journey. Including of course Michael Thelwell, the great Michael Thelwell, who I took creative writing with, who was instrumental to my thinking about composition and character development, all the elements and what matters, what's important in fiction writing and creative writing. Um, so yeah, that's my for those listening, man, there you go. There's my curriculum. Read some Thelwell, read some Smethurst, go look at some paintings by the late great Nelson Stevens, and listen to some Archie Shepp, and bam.
I love that. Absolutely. The Black studies sensibility in a nutshell. How is that carried over to being in a history department? I mean, do you,
Mhm.
you know, I will say that history, very much like English, strikes me as, I mean, it depends on institutions, but strikes me as traditional disciplines that have really stretched the boundaries of those disciplines with some
Mhm.
regularity. But I'm
Yeah.
interested if there's been a kind of complexity in that move from Black studies where you can list those teachers, right, and
Yeah.
those influences to a history department where, that, I mean, it's not just that's the name of the office that you walk into, it's how you get tenure, the kind of courses you teach, and,
Mhm.
has impact on our scholarly values and practices. But how's that transition been?
Yeah. Well, I ended up in an unusual history department, and I'll say for a couple reasons. I mean, first, the big knock was that you're never getting a job in history department if you get a Black Studies PhD. That's what everyone said. I basically had abandoned any hope of ever getting
Ah.
hired in history department, which I, didn't necessarily care. I mean, I was fine with, Black Studies, but obviously there's more jobs in history. So, if I'm going to be a professional, get paid by a university, respect my colleagues. So that's the first thing is that, I was embraced by my colleagues for my broad and diverse interests, and also my desire to see the relevance of history for our students and bringing that passion to them. And so, and one of the things you see, you look closely in my department, nearly, and sadly, people retired, and my colleague Amy Richter sadly, passed away last year. Um, but people women and gender studies. Other colleagues are in Holocaust genocide studies. This colleagues in that, like America's like so. Really, when you look at my history department, you realize when you look underneath the surface that many of my colleagues were, working interdisciplinary way. And the second thing is they were about the work, right? So, they were interested in my first book project and anti-colonization, and they were looking at the product, what I was producing, and what my competencies were in my graduate training. What courses could I teach, and how would I be involved in student life? And so, those were the criteria that ultimately led them to decide to choose me, and which I'm obviously very honored because those of you who are seeking, tenure track jobs, if they still exist soon, it's a long process, and it's very competitive in the sense that there's a great people. Like I'm with other great people who also could have contributed in ways, similar, if not superior to mine. And so that was sort of the reception was really rooted in that, and my process to tenure and stuff was rooted in that work, and not as much sort of performative history sort of ways of being in the space. Um, and then I will say that my arrival at full professor was shocking in the embrace of my colleagues in my novel. Like I can't express to listeners as much my fear that being in a history department, not a Black Studies department, that writing fiction and publishing fiction would be taken seriously and seen as something that instead of I thought it would be seen as a distraction and a cute hobby that I shouldn't be wasting my time doing because I need to be writing history books. And it was the opposite.
That's
I couldn't believe it. My colleagues embraced it. They thought it was great. They loved it. They celebrated. My chair, Professor Reese, she bought copies from my colleague. I couldn't. It was like a shock. I hid it from them. I didn't tell people that I was working on this novel, and then it sort of like was coming out, and Amy found out and was like, Ousmane, do you have a novel coming out? I was like,
that's
yeah.
amazing.
She's like, I can't believe you didn't tell me. And that led to the university even embracing the novel, the president, the provost, and, because they said the content was relevant, and really important to, national conversation about white supremacy and racism. And so, and I say all this because listeners might be, they might be shocked. I mean, I was shocked that a traditional history department and colleagues would, in fact, embrace both me and my intellectual training and also embrace this fiction side, which I had been working on, for many, many years.
I like the phrase you had, they're really just mostly about the work. And so that's you coming out with a novel is that moment where they have to ask the question, like, are they really serious in that commitment? Because a novel is work, right, that you put in, but it's also work towards, as you said, even the higher administration recognized, work towards this understanding of some of the internal structures of not only our contemporary moment, but history. So I love that. That's a great story about how like departments can be the best they can be and not the worst, which is, I don't know how to say it, but it's just not often the case in academia. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, I have two more questions I wanted to ask. And the first one is thinking about Black studies in an historical context and sort of looking into the future. What do you think that Black studies has done well historically? Like, what has the field done well? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
So I think that we are a product of the contradictions that exist in higher ed in the last 30 years. So, Black studies, the discipline, much of the early years, in my opinion, was really rooted in a desire to be embraced and accepted within the context of higher education. It would be seen as legitimate, right? We are creating new knowledge. We are as equally academically rigorous as any department. We have accepted that to some degree, our professional intellectual life would have to conform to the dictates of higher education, right? So that the movement towards Black studies and the culmination in PhDs in Black studies demonstrated that to be the case. and that was the case and it is the case. Um, at the same time, what's the limitations of the discipline are that we have, in some cases, taken professionalism and come to value being professionals more so than some of the work as community educators, or some of the work as organizers, or some of the work as activists. I'm not saying, I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not saying that all people with PhDs in Black Studies should be activists. Not at all. Um, Instead, what I'm suggesting is that the commitment, in terms of valuing community engagement, if you're in Black Studies, even if you didn't get a PhD, if you're a professor in Black Studies right now, and you only understand your value as producing academic books and once in a while going and visiting a class, to me, that you should just be in the English department, or history department. If you're going to be in a Black Studies department, you should embrace, the values. And there, like I said, those are three ways to do it. One, not everyone has to be front and center out there and rallying or feel confident organizing people. But even community education, being able to make that a part of your practice. They talk about, when Black Studies established, they go, Smith say it all the time, you go into the community, your office would be in the community, right? You wouldn't have your office on the university campus. You go across the street and that sort of impulse that the work we're doing should always try, at least aspire to be as connected to the communities we live in as possible. And I think that some of that is tough for my colleagues that find themselves immersed in, the academy and the politics of the academy, right? And next thing you know, they're department chair and they're provost, and next thing you know, they're deans, and they're in all these roles, which are very much, which I've been, I was the chair of the faculty committee and I was overseeing tenure and, it was an administrative position. And of course, it took away time from me doing work with the Documenting Black Lives Project here in the community, right? And so I think that's some of the challenges of being an academic discipline and having a job that is, having an employment by a university. I think that's some of the challenges. And then, of course, there's the informal pressure, even when not exerted on you formally, but there is informal pressure to do things that'll make the university look good, ultimately, right? And so if you are involved in any social movement, globally, domestically, that could potentially be viewed as controversial, there's informal pressure for you to, back away from that. And so that's one of the challenges when you have a job or you're relying on an institution to pay you. You're constantly under those sort of pressures. And so those are to me, some of the challenges we face, and we'd have to continue to think of critically and come together and think about how to support each other.
Yeah, I think that informal pressure that you just talked about is so important to think about and try to figure out like what that means. It's always been there, but the last few years around Gaza has just really brought that out in such a national way, and the penalty is so high for everyone from 19-year-olds just trying to go to class and believe in something to professors at every level. But that's a formal pressure in the sense that it becomes public. But I hear what you're saying in that the informal versions of that made that moment so familiar to so many people. And I think for Black Studies, that's why, in my experience, it's resonated with Black Studies professors as a particular kind of atrocity, but also quite familiar over the last few years, the response to Gaza. So,
yeah, absolutely. And just, just as a aside, I do think that, the more any of us are wedded to the university and to the sort of positions the university takes, especially when we end up in these roles, because some of us are, I wouldn't conclude myself, but others are quite talented at administrating. It certainly has an impact on our desire even to challenge the status quo. You know what I mean? And so I think that's part of it. We want to chase these chairs and these different, sort of different roles that are respected in higher ed. Most people outside of higher, they have no idea what full professor is or associate. But they don't know anything about that. Chair of whatever. They read it. They don't know what that means. So it actually has very little currency. I mean, I still try to explain to people like what it means to be tenured. Most people really don't fully understand that. And so therefore it doesn't have as much social currency. You're a professor.
Yeah.
Right. That's all. You're a professor. So you're part of a certain class. Outside of that sort of class striding we sometimes do in our quest to be the most famous, Black studies professor, everyone would say the next Cornell West or Gates or something like that. No disrespect for those two. But that idea of sort of being like a public intellectual in that kind of way, not the old school public intellectuals who were, sort of seen as pariah and constantly fighting with professors and out in the streets and tussling intellectually. This new professional intellectualism or public intellectualism is really about fame and about being a pop star. You know what I mean? And that's, again, I'm not trying to show shade on anybody. God bless anyone who's doing work to further the cause of Black people. But when it comes to the discipline of Black studies, many of our mentors died broke. Went in exile, were fired from their jobs as principals, couldn't get work, in the academy. I don't think it has to be what one will maybe call like a Jesuit lifestyle, but at the same time, these are the sacrifices we make if we choose Black studies. You know what I mean? That's my view. And I respect other viewpoints, but I'm just saying my opinion is that. And like I said, I have no shade on anybody, no shade on anybody who has different views about it. You do you, I do me. As long as we're doing something, that's better than nothing because most people are doing nothing.
I like that. No, I like this. This is great push that you make in the podcast for us to think really hard about these questions. And so, I mean, maybe in some ways then you've already started to or answered this last question I have for you, but thinking in a Black studies context, what's the question you would want us to all be thinking about or the issue you would want us to be raising?
Well, certainly what's next. We had our run. Some of us, like myself, have been fortunate enough to get salaried jobs where we can get a paycheck every day or every week or month, whatever we get. And that's been great. It's been a great run. What's next? When it comes to Black studies, will the university be a place where we can do this type of work? I think that that's an important question we got to answer. Is the university a place for the future of Black studies?
That's a fantastic place to wrap up an episode, broadly speaking, about intellectual life, but especially Black Studies podcast. That's a really difficult question, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's the one we need to all be asking and contemplating and debating. So I was already looking forward to this, Ousmane, and it's been absolutely a fantastic conversation. This is a really great contribution to the series. So thank you for your time, but really your thoughtfulness. This is really going to be a great contribution to what's really a great series.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
All right. You have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thanks. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.